All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a pretty provocative idea from a source that claims to have uncovered a predictable pattern, a 2,000-year-old cycle that governs the rise and, more importantly, the fall of every major empire in history. It kicks off with this scene, something straight out of a movie, a near-future military op where the leader of Venezuela is captured, and in the process, the world's largest oil reserves, worth trillions, are seized. But here's where it gets interesting. The source we're looking at today asks a really challenging question. Was this just another geopolitical move? Or was it something way more predictable? A single, inevitable step in a cycle that's been on repeat for centuries. To really get what's happening in that opening scene, you have to understand the main idea behind all this. The source argues that history doesn't just rhyme, it actually repeats. And it repeats in a specific, measurable, and pretty much identical pattern for every single major empire. Now, that's a huge claim, right? It's suggesting that it doesn't matter what the technology is, or the geography, or the culture, the fundamental journey of an empire, from its golden age all the way to its collapse, follows a set life cycle. So, what exactly is this pattern? Well, the source breaks it down into 7 distinct stages. You can think of this 7-stage framework as the key to their whole argument. It's the roadmap they use to analyze empires all throughout history. The cycle always starts with a strong foundation of, sound money that builds wealth and lets the empire expand. But prosperity, as it often does, leads to overspending and stretching the military too thin, which forces them to debase the currency, basically to devalue it. From that point on, the decline picks up speed. A desperate grab for resources, a loss of confidence both at home and abroad, and finally, a fiscal crisis that leads to collapse. Let's see how the source uses this to look back at history. Before we even get to the present day, the source really tries to lay its groundwork in the past, arguing this isn't just some theory, but something you can actually see in the historical record. Let's take a look at the evidence they present, starting with the big one, the Roman Empire. This is fascinating. This chart is a perfect illustration of stage 3, currency debasement. The Roman denarius, which was the world's reserve currency back then, started out as 94% pure silver. But to pay for its massive army and all its public works, Rome literally started mixing in cheaper metals. By 265 AD, the coins were less than 1% silver. They destroyed their own money, and that led to runaway hyperinflation. Next up, the source points to the Dutch Empire. In the 1600s, these guys were a global superpower. The Dutch guilder was the world's reserve currency. But just like Rome, military costs and debt started to pile up. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War was the final straw. It bankrupted the empire and handed financial dominance over to the next rising power, the British. The pattern, according to the source, repeated perfectly. And this timeline really shows how the decline of the British Empire was this slow, painful process. After dominating for centuries, World War I turned Britain into a debtor nation. The cost of maintaining an empire just became too much. They had to abandon the gold standard, and by 1944 at Bretton Woods, the torch was officially passed. The US dollar became the new world reserve currency, and another great wealth transfer was complete. So, after building this case with historical examples, the source turns its focus to the present day. It takes that exact same 7-stage framework and applies it to the United States to figure out where we are on this historical clock. According to this analysis, the U.S. has followed the path perfectly. Stage 1 kicked off in 1944 with the dollar backed by gold. Stage 2 was that incredible post-war boom, a time of huge prosperity. And then, Stage 3, the critical moment of debasement, happened in 1971 when President Nixon officially cut the dollar's tie to gold. And that brings us to the next and absolutely crucial stage in the cycle. This is the point where, according to the source, an empire's financial system is so strained that it starts using its military might to acquire tangible, hard assets. And this brings us right back to that scene we started with. So here's the key takeaway. That opening story about the raid on Venezuela isn't just some hypothetical. In the context of this framework, it's presented as the classic, predictable move of an empire that's deep into stage 4, desperately trying to back its fiat currency with something real. And why would an empire be that desperate? The source points to numbers just like this. A national debt of $38.5 trillion. A figure so massive it's almost impossible to comprehend. And it's growing at a rate of over $6 billion every single day. This is the kind of financial pressure that they claim drives that stage 4 behavior. As that debt grows, the source points to what it sees as evidence of stage 5, a loss of confidence. This chart here shows that central banks around the world are slowly but surely moving their reserves away from the US dollar. It's not a sudden collapse, but it's a quiet, steady erosion of trust. And here's another indicator of stage 5, according to the source, capital flight. It highlights that in 2025, a record number of millionaires moved their families and their wealth out of the country. This isn't just travel. It's seen as a vote of no confidence by the very people who have the most to lose. All of this pressure leads to what the source calls stage 6, fiscal dominance. This is basically the point where the national debt is so large that it traps the central bank. As the source argues, policymakers get stuck in an impossible situation. Do they raise interest rates to fight inflation and risk defaulting on the debt? Or do they keep rates low and just watch the currency's value evaporate? So, if the pattern holds, what's next? The final stage of every empire cycle, according to this analysis, isn't just a collapse. It's a massive, historic transfer of wealth from one group to another and from the declining empire to the next rising power. Now, of course, the source anticipates the obvious objection. People always think this time is different. But it counters each of these points with a historical example. Technology will save us? Well, Rome had amazing technology for its time, and it didn't save them. The dollar is the world's reserve currency. The British pound was for 200 years, and it failed. We can just print more money? Well, history has a name for that: hyperinflation. Based on all these historical patterns, the source outlines what it calls survival strategies. We're presenting them here simply as part of the analysis, not as any kind of advice. But the core idea is that throughout history, the people who successfully navigated these huge shifts were those who held tangible assets, who had essential skills, who had options outside the failing system, and who didn't have all their wealth tied up in a single declining currency. And that leaves us with the final critical question. The source we've looked at today presents a compelling, if pretty unsettling case that a 2,000-year-old pattern is playing out in real time. It claims this pattern is absolute. So the only question left is the one that every generation in a late-stage empire has to ask itself. Is this time finally the one that's different?